Welcome back to this Labor Day weekend special edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine created by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy and distributed around the Commonwealth. You can also find archives if you've missed a little bit of it or catch up on previous weeks at our YouTube channel. Just search Freedom & Prosperity Radio. Our next guest is Senior Research Fellow and Data Scientist at the Mercatus Center with George Mason University, Kofi Ampaabeng. Kofi, thank you for taking some time out with us. And I love words, and I love when I hear a new word and get to add it to my vernacular. First and foremost, thanks for joining us this weekend.
Thank you very much, Les, for having me. I'm very happy to be here with you.
So the word I mentioned is evergreening, and I certainly had an idea of what it meant, but then apparently this has to do with regulations and government overreach, or at least oversight over industries. Tell us what evergreening means.
How much time do you have?
Oh, well, we got a whole hour here.
Well, so to start with evergreening, you have to go all the way back to 1983 and sort of just trying to understand the drug industry and how prescription drug processes work.
Okay.
So essentially what happened was you typically have what you call innovator drugs. Mm-hmm. This is what happens when a company takes its time, a pharmaceutical company, takes its time, goes through the drug development process, which can be pretty tedious and very costly. And then it goes through the development process after the drug is approved by the FDA. And typically what the FDA really does is to approve the drug for use. Typically when people go through the process, they usually have a patent, right? Mm-hmm. But the drug approval process can be so long that by the time a drug makes it to the market, the typical patent of about 20 years, maybe it's down to like 12 years. And then once the patent expires, essentially people can copy the drugs and make them available. Now, what happened in 1983 was that there was a dispute between a pharmaceutical company and someone who wanted to do a generic version. Now, before you can bring a generic to the market, you have to wait for the patent to expire. Then you have to go through the entire process of starting the FDA drug approval process.
Wow.
That means that the generic version doesn't come onto the market after a very long process. So this new company was trying to copy a drug, but obviously it was sued by the owner of the patent, and the process played out very long. Eventually, Congress stepped in, which makes sense, in 1984 with the Hatch-Waxman Act, which established a process where pharmaceutical companies that want to produce a generic version of a drug can have access to some of the data that the brand name version, which is the innovator drug that I just mentioned, mm-hmm. had access to in order to get the approval. That way, the generics could come onto the market almost exactly when the innovator drug's patent expires.
Sure.
And it's one of the very good things that usually comes out of Congress. You don't see a lot of them, but it was good, and it's been remarkable. Mm-hmm. Now, as part of the deal to sweeten the deal for the pharmaceutical companies to be part of the process, the Hatch-Waxman Act didn't only sort of help generics get on the market. They will help sort of lengthen a bit of the patent for the innovator drug, the brand name drug, just so that they can get the process started quickly. And it's been amazing. So, for example, in 1983, only about 10% of the drugs had their generics version available after the patent expired. Now it's about 90%.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been good. Now, what happens then is that if you're a brand name drug, when your patent expires and the generic comes onto the market, the price falls precipitously, like there's a steep fall. In fact, by several estimates, within 2-3 years after the patent expires, the prices could drop by 80%,
sure,
85%. And so if you're a pharmaceutical company that you have a blockbuster drug, for example, a blockbuster drug is usually the type of drug that earns billions, mm-hmm. that is on the market. You try to find ways to lengthen the sort of the market exclusivity that you get, right, as part of going through the process. I mean, it makes sense. It's a business decision. I mean, we would all do that if we are in the market.
Mm-hmm.
So in trying to do that and sort of taking advantage of loopholes in the Hatch-Waxman Act, which allows extra market exclusivity for continuous improvement or new drugs. So, for example, when someone makes a drug, let's say the dosage or the form, whatever might change, they might come up with a little innovation, a little change. Mm-hmm. Then that immediately gets more exclusivity is added to the drug. And so if I am a drug maker, then I can decide to just keep making additions. Let me give you an example. Let's say there's Adderall or any of those drugs that are used for treating ADHD. There's what they will come up with what they call an immediate release version. What that means is that once the drug gets into your bloodstream, all of it gets in, and so it's supposed to work. Mm-hmm. As soon as that patent expires, or at least it's about to expire, they make what they call an extended release version. That sort of releases a chemical into your bloodstream sort of over a prolonged period of time. I mean, that's an innovation, right? But then you get a patent on that one, and it keeps going. So people keep making these little changes to the patent or the FDA marketing exclusivity to lengthen how much time they have on the market. And so that's the evergreening process. Now, it's not exactly bad that I make an extended release version, but it's when those changes are minimal, then they take advantage of the regulatory loophole that it becomes a problem in terms of the evergreening. I hope that helps.
Well, yeah, no, and certainly we understand the cost involved in developing a drug, a treatment of any kind is prohibitive. The research and the development into it, but it seems like what you're describing is a way that they figured out. Okay, well, we can pad this bill a little bit without having to expend the cost. Just figuring out, okay, it's time released. This one's a different dosage. And I guess it can be as arcane as this is a liquid gel cap and this was a regular tablet, and so without having to expend those monies to bring a new patent out, they've extended the life of the one that they got originally.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
So what needs to be done to fix these loopholes, Kofi, to tighten it up? Because as you said, it seemed like the bill was working well. Was this a quid for the pro quo to get the original patent makers, agreement to allow some of the research? Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater if we try to fix this?
Oh, absolutely not. Like I said, this is one of those laws that have actually made significant impact and changed the industry. Just to give you an example, about 90% of the drugs that are prescribed are actually generic. Okay, brand name drugs just make a very small share of the drugs that are prescribed, even though they are very expensive. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do you close some of these loopholes in terms of evergreening? Well, we mentioned a couple of things. One is that the length of some of these windows could surely be shortened. Or let's say instead of getting 3 extra years, maybe we could make it 1.5 years. Or we could encourage pharmaceutical companies that apply for some of these to at least bring it in within the original patent expiry date. That way we stop them from gaming the system. But generally, I'm leery of trying so much to close loopholes, mainly because you end up throwing the baby with the bathwater, like you just said, right? The generic market has been, or at least the Hatch-Waxman Act has been incredibly beneficial to American patients. We are able to get a lot of drugs we want at reasonable cost because of that. And so we should be very careful when we are trying to close this particular loophole. There are other egregious things like pay to delay. Pay to delay is essentially where the the brand name manufacturer looks at the potential generic that is going to come onto the market, and instead of allowing them to get in the market, they actually sort of just have some side arrangements so that the generic doesn't actually enter the market. Those are pretty egregious. The FTC has been trying to work on that to get companies to stop doing that. So that's that's one important thing to also do. So stopping pay to delay is actually just as important as reducing evergreening.
Yeah, that seems to be collusion almost to me, where instead of just saying, okay, well, you're going to bring out, you're actually paying the generic manufacturer to not put out the generic. That doesn't seem like it's to the benefit of anyone who needs health care in this country. Kofi Ampaabeng from the Mercatus Center. See, I got the name and your association right this time.
Yes, you did.
But, I appreciate it. So when we look at the cost of prescription drugs, and a lot of people point to it. The president has made a case about, we're going to drive down the cost of these prescription drugs. The peril I worry about is we're going to see less innovation, and I don't know where the innovation is going to be. But then we're also talking about a lot of these companies that are manufacturing these prescription drugs, even if they're United States or Western world countries in communist China without the kind of oversight that we have here. Are these bigger problems to be looking at, and what are some of the things we should be looking at to fix in that?
You're absolutely right. In fact, the CBO estimated that with a lot of the bills that are flying around in Congress that are aimed at trying to reduce price would actually have an effect on innovation. Currently, the number of new drugs that are coming onto the market has been reducing. Right now, we are getting an average of about 30 or so new drugs that are introduced onto the market. It used to be much higher than that. And CBO estimates actually that based on a number of these bills that are going on, if, for example, they try to reduce the pharmaceutical company's profit by, say, about between 15 to 25%, it would reduce the number of new drugs that come onto the market from about 0.5% in the first year, and by the second or third decade, it will drop by 8%, which is not insignificant. Mm-hmm. So there are concerns about trying to keep the cost down. But as I said, generics market has been incredible. I mean, the U.S. is by far the largest market for generics. And so we've done something right in terms of the Hart-Schlesman Act without considering all its flaws. It's been incredibly beneficial. And so in one of the articles I mentioned, for example, while the U.S. pays about 2.6 times for every drug compared to other countries, when it comes to generics, it's actually 0.8, right? So which means we actually pay 15% less than everybody else, which is good. And so we should be putting our effort into getting more generics to get onto the market, while at the same time supporting those innovator drugs that are able to take on the risky research. And bringing a product to market is not cheap. By several estimates, it takes anywhere between $850 million to $1.3 billion to bring a new drug to the market. And we don't want to dry up the motivation, the source of funds for people who want to take the risk, the pharmaceutical companies that want to take the risk to bring in a new drug. Now, in terms of other countries and other places, there's always going to be a risk in terms of how well they regulate their industries. India is a very big pharmaceutical manufacturing place. Canada has a very big generic as well. Canadians actually have a very good regulatory regime, and Indians do have as well. So overall, the issue of tainted drugs or substandard drugs, especially if you are getting them from countries with well-developed regulatory regimes, is not going to be a problem. But it's also important that we make sure that American companies don't lose out as we come out with policies.
I understand that for sure. What about, and we hear this frequently in our medical discussions, these middlemen that work in between the pharmaceutical companies and the doctors. Maybe there's a way we can tweak that in as part of this, because I hear that this is where so much of the cost that the consumer winds up paying for these pharmaceuticals comes from.
Yes, so there are quite a lot of middlemen in the drug manufacturing process. And I think perhaps the most infamous ones are what we call the PBMs, the pharmacy benefits managers, who essentially work with wholesalers and manufacturers and determine which drug can actually get on the formulary, the one that your insurance company is covering, right, for you. And
Right.
they make obviously a lot of money by being able to negotiate, well, whatever price or margins they can get between the users and the pharmaceutical companies. But there's a lot that goes on in the drug market that is messy. So, for example, there's a list price of drug, which is totally meaningless. List price is how much a drug company decides to price its drug when they first introduce onto the market. There's so many rebates that come in over time that it is totally meaningless depending on the law. So, for example, I recently had to purchase a brand name drug out of the market. The list price was somewhere around $430. When I decided to pay it out of pocket, it ended up coming to around $215. This was away from all the PBM and other process. If I had gone through the PBM process, the insurance company would still probably get the list price, and everybody else would make some money out of that $400 that we paid, right? So, but paying it out of pocket obviously was more than my insurance, than if I had used my insurance company, but it kind of eliminated a lot of those things. Some of these things, they are necessary because of really the complexity of the system in the first place, but over time, essentially they become a bottleneck. And so PBMs right now are very unpopular, if I should say the least.
Well, is the insurance industry and these PBMs getting in the way of alternative, choices from between the doctor, where a doctor would say to a patient, "Hey, you need this treatment. Here are a couple of different ways we could go about it," or does it become sort of, well, this is what is approved, this is the pharmaceutical treatment for it, and this is what you're going to take?
It's a mixture of both. And in fact, what I just narrated, I recently wrote my experience getting drugs for my daughter, exactly going through what I just told you. My doctor prescribed one medication that was working for us for a very long time. Sometime down the line, the PBM comes and says, well, hey, we are no longer covering this drug, so we're taking it off the formulary, which means you either go and look for some other versions or you pay for it out of pocket. And this is a doctor who knows me well, or knows my daughter who needs a drug very well, and looking at all the side effects and the considerations, prescribe a particular product. But the insurance company takes it out of the formulary. So essentially what do? You either go and look for a new drug or you pay it out of pocket. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And so all these people have interfered in the process, and here I am. The real relationship is with my doctor, who's sort of been our doctor for like 3 years, and so knows the patient very well, and also knows the drugs very well, can actually prescribe a good medication. But the PBM says, no, we can't cover this. And it's a very painful process that we've built into our health system. These are some of the things that we need to actually start looking at if we wanted to actually reduce the cost of care and drugs and everything else.
Well, I'm glad we have a congressional midterm election coming up this year. We can make this a policy question for them. You can read his stuff at openhealthpolicy.com, also at mercatus.org. Kofi Ampaabeng, thank you so much for joining us this week, and have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Thank you, Lance, for having me. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And enjoy the rest of your holiday weekend. And we will see you here again on the radio next weekend. For all of us at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, so long, and thanks for all the fish.